Welcome to our podcast, where I, Keely Severson, Eric Johnson, and Alicia Swami are exposing mold. Today, our guest is Russell Jaffe. Welcome, Russell. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
You know, Alicia tells me that you wrote a book that was banned from libraries, so I feel like that must have been a really good book. What was in that book?
Oh, it's an interesting little anecdote. So this goes back to the early 80s, and the topic was indoor environmental quality, what has come to be called thick building syndrome. And I took the project because I wanted to propose solutions. I didn't just want to terrify people with the problem. So we go ahead, Sheila Gerzoff, I had one assistant. This was under the governor, but for the Department of Consumer Affairs, Richard Spohn was in charge. And the project came to light under the name Clean Your Room. And what it says is there's 18 problems in the built environment in the new modern energy conserving, mold enhancing ways. And here's the solutions. And it had nothing to do with me, but it had a lot to do with the impact of the report, because the report was used by the OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment of the United States Congress. It was used by the Environmental Protection Agency. It was used by the World Health Organization and, other people that have initials. And then Governor Brown's time was complete, and the new governor was named Deukmejian. And Governor Deukmejian really, really, really disliked not only Governor Brown, but his policies, because it might have been personal, but I think it really was political. And so they made a list of state paid reports. The state of California paid for the report I'm talking about. And they purged them from every, not just state library. They sent a letter to the Library of Congress that refused to throw away the copy. It does exist. I have a copy. It's an antiquity at this point because it was done in the early 80s, but there's nothing I would change in it. And yes, mold was then a problem, and it's more a problem today. And we could talk about the classic examples, including the EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., which turned out to be, in essence, the first site that documented definitively sick building syndrome caused by building techniques, to the point where they ended up having to tear the building down. They could not mitigate it. So Clean Your Room, a classic report by Russell Jaffe under the young Governor Brown. And he and I have stayed in touch. I did his health policy when he ran for national office. And it was an interesting education, because what we said was very simple, which is if you make people sick, it's bad and too costly, and therefore don't make them sick, and therefore change some of your practices. And here's the little anecdote to finish this side of the story. At that time, Gregory Bateson was one of the intellectual heroes for Governor Brown. They had a building which was called Site 1A, now the Gregory Bateson it's the Gregory Bateson office, State of California office building. Anyway, they finished the building, and Sim Vanderen, a very accomplished architect and the state architect, and Hal, what was Hal's last name? Hal, an architect from Berkeley, who's the reason why I did the project. The three of us, we're walking through the building, and Hal and I know that there's so much volatile organic chemicals being off-gassed by the glues and by the synthetic materials that were used at that time because they were considered to be better. And so we convinced Sim to go to the governor and say, please have the ribbon cutting event and the photo op, but do not let the people in the building, and cook it for 6 months. Open all the windows, turn the heat on, off-gas that building because it's going to make people sick. And the governor said, we have to move in because we have to move in because I'm the governor and I say move in. And who moved it? The Office of Appropriate Technology. and their Environmental Protection Agency and other similar groups. And so many people developed asthma and migraines, autoimmunity, eczema, psoriasis, and other chronic illnesses that they had to shut the building down and cook it. And that actually got into the Sacramento Bee because it was really embarrassing to have to, you know, not follow common sense, but follow political expediency. So I'm happy to share that little personal anecdote.
We would love a copy of the report to.
Oh, just send it to me. I'm pretty sure we have it as a PDF somewhere. It's pretty long. It's pretty long, but it is a classic, and some people consider it collectible.
I think you hit on an interesting point, the way that politics are intermingled with science, and it seems to be an overarching theme that's preventing some progress being made in the environmental health side of things.
As someone who came as a skeptic and now would consider himself an environmental physician scientist, spot on. If what you believe or what you know comes from a press agent through the marketing department, I'm telling you, you won't get the true story.
Man.
If you want the facts, it's complicated. It's not like, oh, E equals MC squared, now we can all go home. I wish it was. But mold is a huge cause of chronic ill health in people today. Mold is also mitigatable. You can manage it, you can measure it, you can make sure that the harmful parts do not afflict you, except some of the time you just have to move. Some people become so hypersensitive that they just can't stay, you know, within one molecule of the problem until tolerance is restored. That's not common, but it's increasingly common. It's called environmental illness. However, what I said, molds produce products, molds, young people, good. Molds produce certain products, molds can grow in certain environments, molds are just being molds. It's not personal when people become harmed by mold. But people should not be exposed to mold. And I live out in the woods. And by the way, if you live in the woods, you'll be exposed to certain molds. But I don't get exposed to harmful molds because I live in a permaculture biodynamic food forest. I do. In a mature woods where we have mushroom gills. And
That's
so
incredible.
I want people, so, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I said that is incredible. That's, you know, that is a hashtag for all the generations
please.
out there. Hashtag goals, I would have to say. We all want to live that life, especially those.
Well, yes, and let me say how doable it is. Mine is now 12 years old. It was started by my dear son, Sky. But now, because of permaculture, which means you let the plants live among each others and their little roots interdigitate, and then you add some healthy soil and some compost and little things that plants like, and now they become pest resistant, they're more productive. We actually have 250 edible plants in a, maybe it's a little more than 1/4 of an acre front yard. And I wanted to show that even in our nice zip code here in Northern Virginia, you could have edible landscaping and not just a lawn. And then the folks from GSA, the Government Services Administration, call up and say, you know, you have the only permaculture biodynamic food forest east of the Mississippi that's mature. I say, oh, why are you calling? Well, could we come visit? I said, sure. So when someone who's in charge of a government building wants edible landscaping or permaculture incorporated, they're welcome to come, as you are, to our garden. And whatever is right now it's pickles, tomatoes, and berries, but whatever we have, we share.
That's awesome. Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. Now, I want to ask you something very serious. You know, mold illness is a condition that's hard to treat. There's no big pharma incentive to drive physician adoptions to a new disease category. There's actually disincentives for insurance and building industry that provide political manipulation. So how does one overcome these barriers to establish a research base and drive awareness to the legitimacy to help adoption by the American Medical Association and get listed on the upcoming WHO IDC 11?
ICD 11, but that's okay. Good question. I've been an AMA member for 50 years, and they tell me I have. I'm going to try and give you a short answer to an elegantly important and rather pressing question. Number one, follow the money. And what that means is, if it's liability and the cause of the liability is indemnified by us, by the United States government, then what incentive do they have to avoid liability? Number two, many good words cover a multitude of sins. For example, Environmental Protection Agency. Well intended. As someone who's been involved with these issues for decades, I meet a lot of well-intended people who recognize that what they do is like swimming through molasses in Boston in January. You just have to be very, very patient and hold your breath. It's part of why I left that environment, but I was in that environment. I had the great good fortune of doing medicine and biochemistry at Boston University under some spectacular mentors, joining the public health service at the clinical center of NIH, collaborating on the occult blood testing for cancer testing, developing the concentration technique that allows you to see parasites in stool. We actually did a study in regard to mold way back when, showing that bad mold was bad and people should be able to defend themselves at the surface, at their mucosa, at their skin, at their lips, at their gut. And if they can't defend themselves there, they should be able to defend themselves with first-line immune response right below the surface. But what you said is true. There is no pharmaceutical candidate. There is no approved pharmaceutical that increases secretory IgA, which is protective all over your body. But I know how to raise your secretory IgA. Eat an alkaline diet, eat foods you can digest, assimilate, and eliminate without immune burden. Laugh, touch, and soak. Soak in baking soda and Epsom salts to remove certain surface toxins and dead skin. Come out pink like a baby, not red like a lobster. And then maybe rub your skin. You'd be surprised how much more youthful your skin would look. Not yours, because your skin looks very youthful. But for those of us of a certain age, if you just dry rub your skin, it stimulates the circulation, improves the quality of your restorative sleep, lowers your blood pressure, improves your digestion. And I could go on, but isn't that enough benefit from just dry rubbing your skin? So I do believe that there are self-care things that we need to do urgently because we won't have them marketed to us. There isn't enough profit in them. We won't hear them even from our doctors. And I'll tell you a quick little anecdote. So Mia, my mother-in-law, goes to her cardiologist and she notices behind the cardiologist is a credenza, and on the credenza there is PERQUE Mitogard, which is something I created, micellized CoQ10 in high uptake form. And she says, "What's that?" And the doctor turns around and says, "That's mine." And Mia says, "Well, do you know Dr. Jaffe?" And the woman says, "Do you know Dr. Jaffe?" And Mia says, "Of course I do. He comes with the children." Unfortunately, today, the experts who are expert in certain areas have real difficulty admitting ignorance. I did not learn in the 8,000 plus hours I had in medical school and residency, I learned nothing about functional nutrition, about mold mitigation, about environmental quality, as in nothing. But I had an opinion. Because if it was important, somebody would have told me it was important. And since they told me it wasn't important, my opinion was it wasn't important. My great good fortune was I went to debunk. And I found my ignorance. And most of us who ended up in environmental medicine got there one of two ways. Either we got sick or a loved one got sick, and that's how we got there. Or people like me, we didn't want to get sick, but we needed to understand what was it that they knew that we needed to know that we didn't know, because functional, personal, integrative, holistic approaches, not part of the curriculum, not even today, not even today. So you can only, in my opinion, you can only ask a person for advice where they are competent. Doctors are competent to make a diagnosis and come forward with a prescriptive solution. If you ask a doctor, what is the cause of the problem? What is the environmental relationships? What can I do to mitigate the causes? One of two or three responses. One is, boy, that's a good question. I don't know either. That's an honest response. The other answer is just do what I say because I'm the doctor. That's not satisfying to me anymore. And the other answer is we don't know yet. We need more studies. Yes, I know the environment's important and mold can kill you, but I'm not sure which mold, in which situation, or more importantly, I don't have a script. I don't have a prescriptive solution. Today, unfortunately, most doctors have 5, 10, or 15 minutes with the person, and they have to write their notes in that time and write the prescriptions, which pop out of a computer. I'm sorry, I want to go to a doctor who cares enough about me that when I walk in, they say, how are you? And I remember so-and-so last time. Very often today, people do not expect to see the same doctor again. And the doctor doesn't expect to see them again. And I think that was a step backward. I don't think that was a step forward. So there's lots of systemic issues, all of which revolve around what do we mean about personalized medicine? What do we mean about functional, integrative, holistic, patient-centered care? I'm in favor of all of that, but it's hard to find that in the conventional community.
I absolutely agree. I agree with you 100%. And I think that's actually, hopefully in the future, becomes the norm, functional integrative healthcare. Because as we're seeing, the standard allopathic care is just not meeting the needs, especially for people who have chronic diseases. But the thing is that, you know, a lot of people have healthcare insurance through their employers, and they're only allowed, or not allowed, I should say, are able to afford allopathic care, whereas these functional doctors are, I mean, the cost barrier is so high for a lot of people. So it's almost as if you don't have the money, you're not going to actually be able to get the proper care that you need. So how do we?
Well, let me agree with you, because as you probably know, if you want to know the health status of a community, look at the socioeconomics of the zip code. So write about that. Number two, it's called health insurance. It's not about health and it's not about insurance. And I was taught that by Roy Anderson. Roy Anderson had been president of the American Actuarial Society. He was picked by Justin Branch to run Allstate Insurance, except he had a mystery environmental illness and was in a wheelchair. And a friend of mine asked if I'd make a house call. A year later, he was in remission and decided to bring long-range thinking and planning to the insurance industry. But one of the many things I learned from Roy Anderson is it's called health insurance, but it has nothing to do with health and nothing to do with insurance. It has everything to do with disease care reimbursement. So call it what it is. It's disease care reimbursement. And disease care is getting more and more expensive. It'll be $3.5 trillion this year in the United States, of which 1/3, that's more than $1 trillion, is to bury people early at high suffering and cost. We spend $1 trillion a year to bury 1 million people early at high suffering and cost and take them away from their loved ones? Yep, that's the data. Now, it was our Health Studies Collegium group that pulled it all together, but this comes out of the Dartmouth Atlas. It comes out of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement at Harvard. It comes out of, there actually are people that track statistics, like the National Center for Healthcare Statistics. Used to be run by Kerr White, an amazing man, who told me that I didn't know anything about anything and that he would eventually let me learn. And he did. No. He was tough, but he was right. I knew statistics like a mathematician can quote a formula from a book. I didn't know the meaning of statistics. And he said, if you don't know the meaning, then you don't understand. I said, but I'm an expert. He says, that's part of your problem. You think you're an expert. Those people who are really experts end up knowing how little they know, not how much.
Thank you for that. And, this is a big question to ask, going back to what I was saying. How do we, as patients, how do we demand or how do we fix this misalignment in this current system today?
Thanks for asking the question again. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 answers. One answer is, I think we have to take back control of our health. If you have a disease and it needs a diagnosis, go to a doctor who can make the diagnosis and hopefully the treatment will help you. But I'm telling you, most of the time, people don't need a diagnosis. Their problem is not a prescriptive deficiency. Their problem is a nutritional or environmental or attitudinal or similar. We look at causes, not consequences. Symptoms get reimbursed, procedures get reimbursed. You may or may not know this, but in England, surgeons are considered technicians and they're called Mr. American surgeons looked at that and they started Blue Cross Blue Shield so that reimbursement would go to procedures and to surgeons preferentially. And knowledge, wisdom, experience, where is that reimbursed? So the first point I'm trying to make is we need to take charge of our health promotion, and that has to do with what you eat, what you drink, what you think, and what you do. Notice there was no diagnosis. Notice there was no requirement of a professional. There was no prescription required to eat a healthy, organic, or biodynamic whole foods diet that is rich in grasses, free of grains, that is rich in foods you can digest, assimilate, and eliminate without immune burden, and avoids high on the food chain contaminated foods like fish and meat for most people. There are always exceptions. I do get kosher, halal, totally grass-fed lamb chops from Whole Foods, a wonderful little boutique. If you can afford to pay that much for a lamb chop, as we say, mazel tov, congratulations, good for you. If you want quality food that's high on the food chain, and by that I mean fish and meat, and you don't want a lot of contaminants in what you're eating, I can tell you that it's expensive because the quality food is in short supply. And what I'm saying is eat a lot of grasses and forget all the grains. The grains are what you're used to. The grasses are buckwheat and wild rice, millet and quinoa. Simple staples around the world, nutritionally dense. You can get them easily in organic bulk. You can make them at home, throw in some garlic, ginger, onions, brassica sprout, and eggs. Now you detoxify. Throw in some herbs. I walk out and I harvest basil and parsley and some other herbs and give it a coarse chop and I throw it in. So I think we have been living in a myth that says the doctor knows and has the solution to your health challenge. I'm telling you that's an illusion, and if the doctor was honest, they would say, I can't deliver that. Now, those who get certified by the PIH Academy, and we're in year 4 of certifying professionals from health coaches to physicians, the PIH Academy is an online certification program that not only gives you information and inspiration, it gives you solutions, and it gives you continuing education credit. I think we are in a time of great transition. within a time of transition, there are a few people who just want something new, and they just want something new, and they just want something new, and they're called butterflies. Then you have early adopters. That's where we live. We live with the people who say, give me the evidence, let me test and verify for myself, show me that it is possible to live well and healthy, even in these stressful, challenging, intoxicated times. That's where we live. Then there's a large majority of people called late adopters. They come late. And then there's a category of people more or less called, we're not going to do that. It saddens me to say that whatever training I had in no way prepared me for the challenges of today. And I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who made the discovery. What I did was go to debunk and find people who not only knew how ignorant I was, they were tolerant while they mentored me so that I could correct my ignorance. But you have to do that if you have the time and the privilege and the opportunity. So I go to debunk acupuncture, and I spend 7 years with Queen Nuan Wu, and we translate the non-Qing. I go to debunk acupuncture and yoga, and I meet Ramamurti Mishra, and I become a student, and then he becomes my patient. I go to a birthday party for a Cambodian monk. I meet Bhante. He moves in and teaches me about life and color healing and non-invasive evoking healing responses. And we could spend a whole lot of time talking about the people that I went to debunk, where I ended up first being their acolyte. First, I sat at their feet and drank in what they had to offer. But then I became their doctor most of the time. I am a doctor. And everybody needs a doctor, and they need a doctor who knows it and who cares about it. So it is possible, but you have to look carefully, personally, to find rapport, to find relationship, because that's where healing occurs, in my opinion.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer. I really appreciate that.
I will append one more point.
Sure.
When people come to you grateful for saving their life, don't just say you're welcome. Their cousin might be worth $1 bazillion. Most of the innovative research in the last 15 years was privately funded. And then when it was ready, it could get more public funding. But if you think the public funds are there to lead, you're living on a different planet. 1947 to the late 70s was one time. That was the meritocracy. I had the best of the last of that, and I'm very grateful for it. But starting around 1980, for a variety of political and financial reasons, everything changed. And today, NIH follows with confirmation of vanilla, does not lead. And if you ask them to lead, they will politely say, lead what? That's how long they haven't been leading.
I feel like I'm listening to like a medical sermon, and in my mind, I'm just saying, preach, Dr. Jaffe, preach.
I think, as you can tell, because I wear this little hat, I am a man of science, but I am a man of spirit. I agree with Einstein. I think his famous quote was, science without spirit is blind. Spirit without science is lame. Now that's just a quip, but it's a very thoughtful comment from a guy who actually thought before he spoke, which today is a refreshing change from the people who speak first with great confidence, and people like me listen knowing they don't know what they're talking about. They're just reading a script.
Yeah, we seem to run into a lot of interesting experts that, you know, they're so attached to this idea that if it's not published in the literature, the ideas don't exist. And
every time you hear that, ask them if they've ever heard of Sir William Postler, because everybody's heard of Sir William Postler. Then have they heard of his essays called Equanimitas? Equanimity in Latin, I think it's Latin, is equanimitas. This man spoke, wrote a whole textbook of medicine, And he pointed out repeatedly, you never treat a pathology. You always evoke healing within a person. Now, if they're still listening to you, you quote Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was an interesting guy, kind of known in his time. He was a doctor and he was a lawyer. And he said famously, if you took all the pharmaceuticals and put them in a great sea trunk and threw it in the ocean, it would be all the better for the patients and all the worser for the fishes. The dose makes the poison. Too often, the effective dose and the toxic dose are too close to meet my professional criteria. And I am in a small category called metrologists. I don't know how many metrologists you've ever met, but somebody has to know how to measure measurement, and that's what metrologists do. How do you know a pound is a pound and an ounce is an ounce? Somebody has to tell you, and they have to tell you that somewhere there's a reference ounce or pound or whatever. I fortunately was able to collaborate with folks at the National Institute of Science and Technology, and they said, you know, you care about what all these numbers mean. I said, yes, I care about what these numbers mean. And they said, good idea, because all we do is produce numbers. And they produced brilliant numbers, brilliant, but they didn't know what they meant. And then the people who wanted to know what they meant couldn't understand the numbers. It's a little complicated when you get into the depth of what I would call demystifying quality science. It's expensive to do a good study that is, quote, impeccable. One of my mentors, George Zurr Williams, in 1937, published the definitive article showing that smoking causes lung cancer, 1937. He opened the labs at the NIH. He was a huge deal. Do you know it was not until the 1960s that the Tobacco Institute finally gave up and agreed that tobacco did cause lung cancer? 30 years later, out of a law firm, Covington and Burling. And not only did they handle the Tobacco Institute, then they started PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Trade Association. And today they represent sugar and they represent processed food. And I'm not the first, and I won't be the last, to say that we are eating our way to ill health. And there's a wonderful recent book out called Metabolical about how diabolical it is for processed food companies to fool people with the crave factor that causes you to want more of the bad and less of the good. More of the salt, fat, and sugar, less of the essential nutrients, the essential fats, the essential components that restore us and keep us well. Robert Lustig, Professor Emeritus at UCSF, a world-class scientist, is the author of that book. Many others are saying the same thing that we've been saying for decades, which is if you want to survive today, you have to take your own health into your hands. If you want to help research get done, show up to people who know how to do methodology and volunteer or do whatever you can, because a small pilot study, well thought and well executed, can lead to a change in national policy. I did a study once on 12 people compared to 12 people, and it was enough to change diabetes management in the country. Doesn't always happen. But when it does, your mother remembers it and tells all of her friends.
That's absolutely amazing. And I just want to tack on to what you said is also what we breathe, you know, breathing our way to ill health as well with the conventional homes that people live in. But, you know, just to piggyback on your research part, you know, Eric was actually a prototype for the original chronic fatigue syndrome that broke out in Lake Tahoe. And I'll let him tell his story because
sure.
We're actually working with him to try to get some of our own research going because he has been knocking on researchers' doors. Sure. I mean, Stanford, Harvard, everywhere, and everyone's slamming the door on him. So maybe off camera we can talk about if you have any.
No, happy to. No, happy to. Does the name Steve Schwartz ring a bell?
Not to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know the term CFIDS, chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome?
Very well, yes.
He coined the term.
Oh, Stephen Strauss of the NIH.
Sorry, you're right, Steve Strauss. Colleague of mine, well-meaning guy, wanted to find an infectious viral cause, didn't. His consolation prize was to move to the Office of Dietary Supplements. But on the one hand, really smart. I mean, creatively brilliant. On the other hand, intellectually hobbled. He needed a reductionist solution to a problem that does not yield. It's not a reductionist problem, so it doesn't yield to a reductionist solution. And I knew him well enough that he really got bummed. He got depressed because he couldn't find a virus. He found all sorts of evidence that viruses had been there. Host hospitality is something we think is very important, but consequence and cause often get confused, and he did.
Absolutely. Yes, I remember it well. Dr. Strauss came to Incline Village and got into quite the argument with Dr. Paul Cheney.
Were you there?
Yes.
I'm a fan of Paul Cheney. I don't necessarily always agree, but I always listen, and he certainly deserves to be listened to. And yes, that was a famous debate. And I've already told you I'm a fan of Paul Cheney.
Yeah.
No disrespect to Strauss. No disrespect to Strauss. But well, it would be like, you know, Rousseau and the reductionist Enlightenment people debating with a rabbi, a Talmudic scholar.
Well, you know, Dr. Strauss is portrayed as the most evil person to ever blight chronic fatigue syndrome.
I understand that, but I will tell you from personal knowledge, that's not true. Might have been wrong, might have been profoundly wrong, but the notion that somehow he was part of a dark force or something, not true.
Fascinating.
I'm not saying that's not within the realm of possibility. I'm telling you, Steve himself. And he took it personally. I can tell you, I've been popular and I've been unpopular. And one of the things my mother taught me was don't jump off a bridge just because they gave you a bad review in the newspaper.
Yeah, so, Dr. Strauss, he had initially blamed a mutant form of Epstein-Barr virus.
I know that, and how wrong he was. He confused consequence with cause and host hospitality, etc. And yes, he spent a lot of your taxpayer money proving that he was wrong.
And his debate with Dr. Paul Cheney was that he was trying to apply this Epstein-Barr virus theory to the Lake Tahoe mystery illness outbreak. And Dr. Cheney came up with evidence that showed that this was clearly wrong. So at the same time, Dr. Paul Cheney and his partner, Dr. Daniel Peterson, sent blood down to the Gallo lab, and they discovered a brand new virus, HHV6 alpha. And Dr. Strauss immediately switched his focus to HHV6, did a study, and was convinced that possibly this was the new cause for the mystery illness, for the fatigue illness that was sweeping the nation. And when the blinded trials, the study was found they cracked the code, it completely fell flat. And it turned out HHV6 was not the cause.
Right. And Gallo, Bob Gallo, at the time, Gallo was one of these very smart but very Machiavellian people. And he got Strauss at a time when Strauss was vulnerable, and they went down this so-called feline leukemia, HHV6, etc., which was another dry hole. It was another dry hole. Do you know the story about Gallo and Montagnier?
Yes, I do.
So you know that the reason that France got all the royalties was because Gallo forged a negative that he stole from Montagnier. Do you know that?
Very much aware of that, yes.
Okay. My brother Mitch, God bless him, My brother Mitch has 650 megabytes on a computer somewhere of all the malfeasance that Gallo was involved in, all covered by his protege, who became the head of the Cancer Institute. And if you want to look at someone who might be under a shadow influence, it would be him. I think Strauss was an honest scientist. I think he came with a bias. I think he proved that he was wrong, and that it bummed him out. The people who knew that viruses caused autoimmune disease were all either propagandists or under the influence of a propagandist. There is no scientific basis for their reductionist, mechanistic misunderstanding. You just have to live within the reductionist silo.
Well, after the HHV6 study showed that it was not the cause, Strauss turned his attention to environmental factors.
He did.
And he wanted to look into the sick building syndrome.
Oh, he did. No,
Yeah.
That's true. That's not a cover. That's not an urban legend. That's true. But you know what happened?
Yes, the virus theorists were so powerful at that time that they completely overwhelmed the field, and they would not allow study into the sick building syndrome component.
What a shock. I am shocked. And
Yeah,
I'm horrified.
Now, when Strauss was running up against the viral theorists in the Holmes Committee, and he wanted to defeat them, initially he came into the Holmes Committee about, they were going to debate what to do about this mystery illness. He came with his own name, neurasthenia. And he was going to...
No, he resurrected it. This was a word that goes back to Sir William Postler.
Well, he added an O into the middle.
You're absolutely correct. No, you really do know the issue. You keep going, because you're right.
Yeah, he modified the name just slightly, and he was going to add one more term, sporadic neurasthenia.
Aha. Or idiopathic, or beats me.
Yeah, and this was supposed to be a loose term to study environmental causes. And the viral theorists completely overwhelmed him, would not allow it. And so they got into this big battle. And when it turned out the viral theorists in the Holmes Committee were going to dominate the field, he decided to destroy the syndrome. He decided, right, since he couldn't stop them, the best thing for him to do was cast the new syndrome into so much doubt and confusion that it would collapse under its own burden of confusion. And then he could take over and proceed on with his own studies. So I got a little perturbed at this point, because actually there were viruses, or what appeared to be a virus, involved as a trigger. And I thought that if Dr. Strauss was to successfully cast the new syndrome into so much confusion, that this would result in wild battles and people just completely out of control for many years to come. So I thought, no, what we have to do is look back at the original incident and take all the factors into account, the sick building syndrome and the viruses that were going through at the time. But the viral theorists were not willing to do that. And Stephen Strauss's name was cast into complete disrepute at this time. And I remember you brought up something that just absolutely blows me away. I'd forgotten about that building that Jerry Brown was working on. Remember, we called him Moonbeam.
Governor Moonbeam, Site 1A, now the Gregory Bateson building, but also the EPA headquarters.
And that was Moonbeam's moonshot.
It was. Absolutely. No, absolutely. This was as political as it got in regard to claiming a space where he would get political contributions from agriculture, from construction, from biopharma, from insurance, and nobody would know where he really stood.
And part of the, it was an architectural masterpiece, an amazing
Oh,
looking
yes.
building.
No, Sim Vanderen, the guy we were walking with, it was his masterpiece, and genuinely is, from a visual, architectural, appropriate use of materials. But at the time, they really didn't think about indoor air. They didn't think about off-gassing. They didn't think about synthetic materials. It was mind-boggling to people like me that these topics had not even hit their radar, let alone know what to do to prevent people from being harmed.
Yeah, and it had like a garden inside with
Oh, yes.
the rocks and the waterfalls and all the stuff, the water cascading down.
There were some very brilliant parts about it. If you flow water inside a building, it helps clean the air. If you put hundreds of tons of rock underneath, you can heat and cool. There were a lot of parts of it that really were well executed, well designed. But that to me made the other part, the lack of anticipatory health thought. I think today in Scandinavia, if you want to have a modern super insulated building, there's a period of time where you have to cook it. You have to open all the windows, turn the heating system on, and off-gas the building before you get an occupancy permit. It costs too much money for people to develop asthma and migraines and eczema and all sorts of autoimmune self-attacking conditions. And then the one in Canada, this was a Canadian Department of Defense building, and it was super insulated. And when people came to work, there were little cups, and you had a choice of aspirin, Tylenol, or ibuprofen, because so many people had aches and pains and other things that they just gave out pain suppressants, until they found that that was just the tip of an iceberg. And now they had a lot of chronic disease claims that they had to pay for because they had done it to them.
Yeah, in the original chronic fatigue syndrome cohort, which occurred in a high school in Truckee, which was the reason Dr. Paul Cheney called the Center for Disease Control for Health. I remember that's exactly how they were. They had industrial-sized bottles of aspirin lying around.
They did. And it's mind-boggling. And you say, why do you have that? Well, it takes away my headache. Well, why do you have a headache? Well, only when I'm here.
Yeah. And
no, it's not your boss. It's not always your boss. Sometimes it might be, but not always.
Yep. And the debate in the inhabitants of this building were which combinations of painkillers they could take, which was most effective. And
excuse me for jumping in, but the way I summarize that is you have your choice. You can sacrifice your kidney, you can sacrifice your liver, or you can sacrifice your heart and your blood vessels. Which do you want to sacrifice?
Well, they wanted to sacrifice their brains and their health because that's exactly what happened.
No, they were intellectually not brain dead. They're not brain dead. They were intellectually unprepared to grapple with the consequence of their assumptions, because assumptions, they'll make an ass out of you and me pretty quickly.
Yeah, and Stephen Strauss, when it appears that the viral theorists were getting out of control, he insisted that the new syndrome be called by a trivializing name, chronic fatigue syndrome.
Right.
And the Portland, Oregon EBV support group, they were being addressed by a cancer specialist named Seymour Grufferman. And he said, you're never going to get anywhere with a name like chronic fatigue syndrome. And he proposed that they insert the immune deficiency into the middle of chronic fatigue syndrome to try to get the syndrome taken more seriously. And they immediately changed their name to the CFIDS Association.
Right.
And tried to publicize this in order to force the Center for Disease Control to create a more serious name, which they never did. So CFIDS was never officially adopted.
And in the United Kingdom, it's called
myalgic encephalomyelitis.
That's it. There you go. Myalgic encephalitis, which is a very powerful term coined by a very important doctor who was a doctor to the doctor who took care of the Windsors.
Sir Donald Atchison.
So when they became controversial, they had friends in high and low places. So in the United Kingdom, myalgic encephalitis has some respect, and they are doing some studies. And we should be leading, not follow. But the leadership, in my opinion, will now come from the private sector, not the public sector. Public sector might confirm and replicate and so forth, but it's going to be private individuals who care and have loved ones with the problem that create opportunity for innovative thinking and, more importantly, quality research. Because you could do a nice pilot study and then people will tear it apart. By definition, a pilot study is meant to learn from. It's not meant to be everything to everyone. But if you don't do a pilot study, you could actually do a big study and then realize there was one variable missing or something like that.
Well, this has been an amazing trip down memory lane, a lot of history here. And I just can't believe that you actually knew Dr. Stephen Strauss, because
I was a contemporary of his. And now a name that I do want to mention, Harvey Alter. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah, with the mycoplasma study.
Mycoplasma, hepatitis, work with Bruce Blumberg, the guy who got the Nobel for hepatitis. And so when I was running the blood bank at NIH with his help and others, he comes to me and he says, you know, it's kind of funny that people who are heroin addicts in the United States, they get the kind of serotype hepatitis that is rampant in the Middle East and not the kind of hepatitis that's in the United States. And he says, why don't you call up the DEA and see if they have some samples of street heroin, and we'll analyze it for hepatitis virus. And I thought, I'll bet if we did that, we could publish it. So that was my first thought. My second thought was, I'll bet nobody did that before, because you can't just call up the DEA and have them give you evidence, even if it's, you know, expired. But I was at the clinical center. I call up and they say, sure. So I go down and I'm going to receive a series of specimens, the total of which is 10 kilograms of street heroin. And they even know, but they don't, we're asking them not to tell us. They know which ones were associated with hepatitis outbreaks and which ones were not. And then it occurs to me, if there's an accident in my car as I drive back to Bethesda, how am I going to explain what's in the back seat? And so I say to them, may I have a class 1 license? Now there's class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Most doctors are 2, 3, 4. Class 1 is heroin and stuff like that. And they go to the person who's in charge, and the person who's in charge says, we can do that. So they gave me a class 1 license. I go back, and the reason I'm telling you the story is not only did we prove that there was hepatitis antigen that had survived the very harsh chemistry of turning poppy juice into heroin or similar, but Harvey went on to prove that it was actually infectious. So I actually published with Harvey Alter in the 70s what turned out to be a very big surprise, which is you can treat certain infectious particles with very harsh chemicals and they're still bad mojo.
Fascinating.
And Harvey finally made it to, well, he was in the National Academy of Sciences for a long time, but I think he got the Nobel Prize himself, like 2 years ago. Wonderful human being, thought that Steve was on the wrong track, tried to bring Steve around to our broader view. He didn't know the answer. He just knew it wasn't all mechanistic.
Well, I want to be sure and get it in here that I'm doing the heretical act of trying to clear Stephen Strauss's name.
Good for you. No, good for you. Before you told me that, I already told you my respect for him. That doesn't mean I have to agree or that he would agree with me on all matters. But respect absolutely, and does his name deserve to be remembered and well remembered as an honest scientist within his time and frame.
It's ironic that due to the confusion over the chronic fatigue syndrome, the circumstances under which the syndrome was brought into existence, it created all these wild arguments that have never been settled. People never went back to find out exactly what happened. And Dr. Cheney is considered to be heroic for his pursuit of viruses. And Dr. Strauss is considered the most evil person in the history of medicine. Whereas I believe that if Strauss had been left to his own devices, he would have eventually looked into the environmental factors in the sick building syndrome, because he signals his intention to do so.
Complicated subject over a glass of wine or Prosecco sometime. We'll talk more about that.
Dr. Jaffe, is it okay if we extend our time a little bit more? Because there's just one more.
I was just looking at that. Yes, I do have a little bit more, and so I'm happy to continue if you folks would like.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. Now, so looking back to the 30s when the Dust Bowl happened, there was a lot of failing crops, dust pneumonia occurred. In the last 2 years, we've been having these massive Saharan dust storms. I believe last year there was 20 million tons of Saharan dust that hit the United States. It was called Godzilla. Now, what I want to know is these particulates that are coming through the atmosphere, the dust that, you know, has been shown to contain a lot of environmental toxicants like metals and such. When that hits the United States, does that do something to the microbes in the environment, or does that cause any kind of illness? Because it seems like there's a lot of interesting things happening right now in correlation when that dust storm hit recently in July. There's a summer flu happening amongst like adolescents right now that people are baffled about. You know, newspapers and newscasters are saying that, you know, we should expect to see an uptick in respiratory issues. So I just wanted to know your thoughts and ideas on that, since you are pretty well versed in environmental toxicants.
Well, starting with what you were just talking about, what we do know is that every year, the way in which mercury and arsenic-based fungicides are sprayed in Saharan Africa, that 100 tons of mercury and arsenic are lifted up into the high atmosphere, come all the way across the ocean, and deposit all along the East Coast, from the Caribbean to Newfoundland. And if you think you're okay on the West Coast, there's 100 tons that comes from the Gobi Desert, Mongolia, and China. That's a fact. It's not an opinion. Many organizations have confirmed. Now, you added an interesting additional wrinkle. Is there anything about the most recent dust storm, which, by the way, is not associated in time with the proper offset to what you're talking about? So I don't think it has to do with these uptick in what is happening. Weaker lungs, weaker hearts, weaker blood vessels, more comorbidities, and we try to link cause and effect. Maybe. The last few hundred times I tried, it was more complicated. So are we being exposed to toxic metals at a level that at a minimum, you need a minimum of 2 grams a day of nature's fully reduced vitamin C ascorbate just to deal with today's toxic metals, let alone any you might have accumulated over the last few decades? And then what about the hormone disrupting persisting pollutants, the POPs? What about the solvent residues? What about the mold products? What about the isotopes? I didn't used to have to even mention isotopes, but then Chernobyl started, and 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, and others, because I am rated all the way through uranium. I could tell you stories that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. How close we came to meltdowns before Fukushima, and how foolish in hindsight, how unnecessary, how penny wise and pound foolish that whole disaster was. But just for personal disclosure, when Chernobyl started to melt down, within 7 minutes of the satellite noticing that it was melting down, I get a call from my friend Amory Levins, who has Armin Hammer on the phone. Armin Hammer's surgeon, the head of the scientist for atomic welfare, a fellow named von Hippel out of Princeton. And I don't know why they're calling me. And the answer is Chernobyl is melting down, which means the water is all contaminated. And I said, well, the answer is very simple. You have to bring tank cars of water in, put vitamin C in the water to keep it sterile, and bring the people out on those same trains that bring the water in. Well, this got all the way up to the Politburo. If you don't know what the Politburo is, I'll tell you some other time. But some lawyer in the Politburo says, well, eventually this will come out and we will look bad. Well, they looked worse because they sent the water in. They had to do that. They didn't put the vitamin C in, and they didn't bring the people out. And to this day, Chernobyl is still melting down. To this day, Fukushima is still melting down. The largest refrigeration process in the entire world failed because if you try to freeze a nuclear meltdown, I am 100% confident the nuclear meltdown will win and your refrigeration system won't work. But on day one, in regard to Fukushima, my friend Amory Levins and I and his colleague in Japan urged the prime minister to bring in seawater and boric acid and save the other reactors. On day 3 of Fukushima, the prime minister flies in on his prime minister's helicopter and finds that TEPCO lied. They lied to the prime minister. So he ordered boric acid and seawater, and they only lost 3 out of 4 reactors. If the 4th reactor had gone, they would have had to evacuate Tokyo. Do you understand that if you have to evacuate Tokyo, there is no Japan? That's just one example that took a few days and it's still going on. And I'm really sad to report that today in North Tokyo, people bring a Geiger counter when they go to buy their vegetables. And if the Geiger counter starts going click, 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 someone runs from the back and takes that away and brings out a new tray of vegetables. Do you know that when I was young, we knew that there were Geiger counters. We didn't know how to use them. We didn't think we would need them to go to the store just to buy a carrot. Well, that's the time we live in.
Yeah, one of the things about the Lake Tahoe outbreak was that, you know, Lake Tahoe is pretty high up in the Sierras. It's a beautiful, pristine place. And it seemed like if there were any environmental problems, that would be the last place where it would occur. But the pollution from the San Joaquin Valley had been getting higher and higher every year until 1985, when it finally crested the Sierras, spilled into the basin,
right,
and completely filled the area with a blue haze. It was this exact time when the crayfish died, frogs disappeared, the birds looked sick, the trees looked terrible, and the mystery illness occurred. So that's why we were wondering about the Saharan dust storms, because it seems like there's some aspect of pollution that when it affects the microbial terrain, it can result in a cascade of effects that can unleash toxins.
No, that's exactly right. Very often the toxins are stored until acid rain or certain other man-made influences liberates them.
So we actually have newspaper articles describing this. And amazingly enough, when Lake Tahoe, when researchers come to, every once in a while, they still do come to Lake Tahoe to discuss this famous origin of chronic fatigue syndrome. I've been telling you about the sick building syndrome. And at the same time, another survivor approached these researchers who are, they just come in, they want to talk about their own theories. They don't listen to us. But he was getting right in their faces, telling them about the Bateson building, saying that's a perfect example of what happened here.
Yes, it really is. It's a moment in time. It's a meaningful moment, but I was there. I didn't just read the Sacramento Bee. And for whatever reason, I have had the great good fortune to be present a couple of times. Cheney was a very complicated guy, but certainly a man who deserved, first of all, he deserved to be listened to and respected. And if I remember, he ended up, for his own personal reasons, on the East Coast of the United States, and maybe even on an island or something, but in a place that he thought was healthier for him, because he had his own health challenges. And then there are the people who say they tried to hurt him. I don't know. I don't know. I know too much to just dismiss that out of hand, but unless you show me the facts, I refuse to be paranoid.
Well, the Chamber of Commerce was so distressed over the way Dr. Paul Cheney drew national attention to our little town that
Right.
they tried to destroy him.
They did, and they were motivated, and they were, I think, funded. But yes, very often when a person like Paul Cheney is, quote, attacked, you don't know where the money came from. The Chamber of Commerce said that he held Lake Tahoe in a bad light. Look, people knew about Lake Tahoe. If you asked 100 people who knew about Lake Tahoe, how many of them knew about Paul Cheney and that he held it in a bad light? One? I mean, to us, it was a big issue. To us, it was a big issue. And locally, in the Tahoe area, very important issue that, in my opinion, it was strangled and squashed.
Yeah, the ski resorts basically were very politically connected, and they went to Representative Paul Laxalt and actually warned him that if he didn't intercede with the Center for Disease Control and do something to derail the focus on Lake Tahoe, that he would never be reelected.
And he believed them. And he was Paul Laxalt. This was like going to Ted Kennedy or going to Hatch and saying such things. But he took them seriously. He knew who buttered his bread.
Yeah, there's a fairly good circumstantial evidence that the Center for Disease Control responded to this pressure and just dropped the investigation.
They did. That's not circumstantial. That path has been documented. It's not as simple as it seems, but yes, it did, and no, it shouldn't have happened.
So at the time, I was actually impressed with Stephen Strauss's decision to call the syndrome chronic fatigue syndrome, because the pressure on Lake Tahoe, the economy was suffering, businesses were going bankrupt, people were refusing to come to the ski resorts. I mean, we seriously were in trouble. And I thought, well, this is brilliant if they give the syndrome a stupid name and say that there's nothing specific going on at Lake Tahoe, diffuse it over the larger picture of people getting sick across the nation, then they can pursue this matter quietly. But instead, the CDC took their own cover-up seriously, and they never proceeded on any of the evidence.
Since you've mentioned the CDC a few times, do you know about the EIS?
The Epidemiological Intelligence Service?
Do you know what that is? Do you know the name?
Well, it's basically damage control.
It's the CIA of the CDC, and you cannot be an institute director at the National Institutes of Health today without spending 2 years being brainwashed there, because I was offered, and I said no. And they said, well, you know, that's going to affect your career. And I said, let me check with my mother. And they said, that won't work. And I said, no, thank you. And they said, you don't understand. This is not something you can say no to. I said, I just did. And I went to my boss, and he said, tell them to go fuck themselves, because that was the day when you could do that. Not anymore. Not anymore. But yes, I know that about as well as anybody you could talk to in terms of who was there as opposed to who read the report. Because what gets written and what gets edited and what gets redacted, just don't believe it's the truth, the whole truth. It's a little bit of the truth, with a whole lot of spinning around.
Well, Dr. Gary Holmes actually did a very competent and adequate investigation of the circumstances. And this was reported back to the CDC. This was also presented to the NIH. And they were fully aware of the situation.
Oh, no question. No question. And Gary Holmes is one of the unsung heroes of this saga. High integrity person, didn't come with a bias. He was just, he was just him.
And next to Stephen Strauss, Dr. Holmes gets more blame for the confusion caused by the chronic fatigue syndrome debacle than anybody else. And yet, as you say, he was honest and he did good work.
And if you think good work goes unpunished, think again.
Yeah, I'm definitely learning that. So I'm hoping to get this story out there by saying that we can reconsider some of these concepts, these ideas that people have had for all these years. Because if you just look at how the syndrome came about, all these matters can be settled actually within a few hours.
Well, if you were rational, but okay.
I try.
Yeah, Dr. Jaffe.
Who supports you? Where do you find communities of interest that not only agree with your questions, but have resources to support the investigation?
I've got these two girls here.
Oh, absolutely.
We wanted to ask you because we are really interested at this point. I mean, again, Eric has been trying for 35 years to get someone to research this stuff. And at this point, we're willing to take it into our own hands. And so what I wanted to ask you, and something you said earlier, is all the innovative research has come out of private funding. Now, do you have any advice or guidance for us on how to obtain that? And also, where can we find an honest researcher that's willing to help us with this? Would you be willing to possibly co-pilot a study with us, or just throwing out ideas here?
Let me come around to the answer. What I'm hearing is that you want to do something meaningful that will move the needle. You don't want to just do something for the sake of doing something.
100%.
Okay. Right now, or when you folks want, I can talk to you about where are the resources that exist that are super well funded, that will provide the data, that if that data was properly analyzed, and if it was properly overlaid with the proper individual and environmental assessments, would show that 1 million people a year die at very high cost, about $1 trillion plus a year. And that trillion could actually be redeployed to health promotion. Instead of America losing 1.5 years on average lifespan while it spends every more, America could actually get healthier and spend less. But if you had $1 trillion a year coming through something and someone came by like me and said, give it up, would you? Not easily. That's the problem. Ask anybody who's successful in business, and one of the things they'll say is follow the money. Because more than ever, and I had the privilege of being at NIH when it was a meritocracy, because the growth of our budgets always exceeded inflation in healthcare, and therefore we always had enough. In fact, when I was there, it was called September money, because October is the fiscal year for the government. And so you always had money left in September, and you had to spend it, because if you didn't spend it next year, you wouldn't have that same amount of money. It's completely different today. It's like the curtain came down and the curtain went up. It is the way it is. If it had stayed the way it was, people like me would still be at NIH. The fact that we're not actually tells you a lot, because the people who stayed were the politicians and not the creative types. The people who knew the answer stayed. The people who were paid stayed. The people who left were the ones you wanted to stay. So creating a meritocracy is not easy, and I will tell you the short story, which is the reason that NIH came into existence in 1947, and the reason that the government bought a 1 square mile monastery that the Catholic Church didn't need in Bethesda, Maryland. Why? To pull together all government research into one meritocracy that would be very well funded, and therefore people wouldn't have to fight about money. They could actually be good scientists. Albert and Mary Lasker, Florence Stevenson Mahoney, Emil Daddario, Lister Hill, William Fulbright, half a dozen people changed the course of history. And by the way, they wouldn't have known the biomedical complex from a stone. What they wanted was an alternative to the military-industrial complex, which was going to take over the entire economy. And the only thing big enough was health. 5 people altered the course of American healthcare? Look them up. The Lasker Award is the stepping stone to the Nobel Prize. Florence Stevenson Mahoney provided me a place to stay when I needed a place to stay. And by the way, the movie The Exorcist was filmed in her home. She was friends with Bill Blatty. These are not insignificant people. Emil Daddario, Lister Hill. The Hill-Burton Act created hospitals all over the country. We didn't need them, but it paid for them. Be careful when you try to do good. It's not easy. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do good. I'm just saying doing good is not easy. And if doing good ends up making a lot of money for a few people, I'm pretty sure it will end up not helping people. That's why it comes back over and again to individuals who have a personal interest, a personal need, and then you do, as you correctly said, you need to have someone who knows methods, methodology. There are people, and right now, many of them are looking for meaningful work, so I can refer you. My plate is full. I'd love to say, yes, I can, but I learned a long time ago that there's only a few things I can do well, and the rest I have to leave to others. Would I like to help? Absolutely. Would I be available to kibitz? Would I be available to help point you in a helpful direction? Absolutely. I promise you, right as we speak, there are many people in Singapore who would love to fund you, but they just don't know who you are and you don't know who they are. And why Singapore? Look up Jennifer Yeo and her husband. Look up Singapore, but look up Jennifer Yeo, Y-E-O, and her husband. Well, he was the foreign minister, and now he's about to become the president, and she's a lawyer, and she's a friend, because she cares. She cares about the future. She cares about young people. She had a youngster who got cancer, and when the cancer was taken care of, thank you, she realized that aftercare was forgotten for many of these young people who survive cancer, but they're not back in the pink of health. So she started an aftercare program in Singapore. At a time when I showed up and they were about to start the program, and I said, where are you going to put it? She says, oh, on the 3rd floor. I said, the 3rd floor? She says, oh, there's a 60-story building, and it has a hotel, and it has a hospital, and it has fancy offices, and they've given me the 3rd floor. I said, give? Because this is a big building, and it costs more than $20. She says, oh, we did pro bono legal work. They gave me the 3rd floor for the aftercare program. It's the model for the world in cancer aftercare. Look up Jennifer Yeo and family. There are people who care. There's actually a Buddhist university. It's called Nalanda. That was its original name. It's in Bihar. This is a very impoverished part of India. But for 1,000 years, there was a learning institution whose entire focus was to serve the people and make them healthier. And then a whole bunch of bad people came in and killed it, but they brought it back. And the guy who started the Grameen Bank is on the board of that. And he's an interesting guy from Bangladesh, where you would think there wasn't 2 kopecks. The people of goodwill will persevere, and they will accomplish goodwill in whatever context they can. Small, medium, large. And what I say to people is do what you can. Grow a tomato and then grow 2 tomatoes, and you have one, and give one to someone else. And I will end with the 2 potato stories. So a man named Ram Das, also named Richard Alpert, goes to a man in the Himalayas known as Guruji or whatever. And he says, tell me what to do. And the man says, here are 2 potatoes, 2 cooked potatoes. I want you to go down to the creek or the river, and I want you to sit under this specific tree, and I want you to eat the 2 potatoes. And he goes and he eats 1 potato, and a beggar comes by and says, I see that you had 2 potatoes, and I'm starving. Give me your 2nd potato. And out of compassion, he gives the guy the 2nd potato. He goes back to the man who looks at him and says, did you think I needed the 2nd potato? Think about that one for a while. I live with people who do that. They don't just talk about it. They don't just send you to a book. They do it. They boggle your mind, and then they say, and let's go to dinner, or let's have a cup of tea.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe, for that story. And that's exactly what we are trying to do.
I know.
You know, at the core
And
of
it will happen. It will happen. Keep the faith. It will happen. You'd be surprised where you have friends in low and high places. Persevere. Never give up. Never give up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and we totally understand that you're really busy. And if you have those resources on the people, foundations, places, feel free to send it on by to my email, because I think that's really just the barrier right now is we're doing so many things and we're starting this foundation. And the core of what we want to do is prove basically causality of what's going on in the environment and how to help this patient base that we're dealing with that, you know, Keely, Eric, and I have severely suffered injuries from mold, and we know the pain and the suffering and the loss that came with it. And we really want to stop that just based upon our efforts, and also putting out research and trying to get mold illness recognized, because it is harming so many people and it can manifest in so many different ways.
Well, if I may ask, why do you think there's such resistance to understanding mold illness?
Well, it's political, right? Something that you had mentioned earlier, and the financial industry would basically fall out, right? If everyone knew that their drywall was preloaded with Stachybotrys and all it needs is a water event, humidity issues, or a food source, and then all of a sudden your indoor air quality is poison. I think if everyone knew this fact, insurances would be in big trouble.
Let me throw in something here. Why couldn't Dr. Paul Cheney, Dr. Stephen Strauss, Dr. Daniel Peterson, Dr. Anthony Komaroff, why couldn't they comprehend the sick building scenario when they investigated it? They're all in one group, in one small town, looking at the same thing. They're seeing all these sick building syndrome incidents arise simultaneously. And I talked to Dr. Cheney at the time, and he said, the reason that we are not going to attach importance to this is because it is impossible for all these different sick buildings to get worse at once. It has to be a virus. And I said, what if they did? What if they did all get worse at once? Maybe if there's something.
What if it was the construction techniques? What if it was the change in construction, the change in fresh air infiltration, the things that you know about, that I take it he didn't, because he really deserves to be remembered, and positively so. But there were times when he wouldn't listen.
Yeah.
I mean no disrespect, because I've probably been there myself. But with these issues, if anytime you stop listening, you lose.
Well, the way that the sick building syndrome emerged so quickly in Lake Tahoe, it threw everybody for a loop. They just could not accept that there had been this significant of a change. And once they went down the viral path, they never looked back.
Right, because what you just said, Alicia, look, follow the money, follow the insurance, follow the liability. So I become friends with this guy, Roy Anderson, who explains to me that health insurance has nothing to do with health and insurance. Then he comes to me and he says, you know, we insure, we have a liability company, Allstate has a liability company, and we insure things like asbestos, formaldehyde, and mercury and lead. I said, would you mind if I looked at the portfolio of the risk analysis and whatever? And I concluded that they were under reserved by $250 million, which even for them was a big number. And they didn't want to hear it. And they were owned at the time by Sears. And they ended up paying $480 million. Because Roy called me up and said, you were right. I said, about what? Because at that point, I didn't even know what he was talking about. He said, we were under reserved. I said, by how much? He said, well, about $500 million. I said, did they notice? He said, yes. I said, will they do it again? He said, no. I said, well, maybe they should talk to us before they do it again.
That's very interesting.
When you change something fundamental like construction techniques, and that has a liability, if you think the insurance companies and the construction companies are going to let you understand that risk, what planet do you live on? You have to at some point follow the money.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter whether you have it or you don't have it, you just have to respect it because it is what it is. It's one of the fluids that allows things to happen.
Well, now there's a growing number of us that want our health back, and we don't care about the money. We'll do whatever it takes.
No. All good. All good. I just think you need to find a few people, friends or relatives or whatever, who also want what you want and have the money. And where would this come from? Social responsibility investors, Oz Crosby. There was a guy named Oz Crosby. He started Social Venture Fund. His sister helped found Esalen Institute, which is a place where people go for seminars. The reason that Esalen exists is because Michael Murphy, Oz Crosby, Harriet Crosby, and a few people knew that the Soviet Union was going to run out of money. And if it ran out of money, the nuclear armaments might actually proliferate because the people guarding them would be paid in vodka, which, by the way, did happen. Esalen was actually a cover for a people-to-people diplomacy project because the United States State Department was absolutely caught off guard. Caught off guard when the Soviet Union dissolved, caught off guard in Iran. At the moment, you can't depend upon our State Department to have a clue about what's going on in the world. We should. Don't you think we have diplomats who have, common sense? By the time they become successful diplomats, common sense has been pretty much beaten out of them intellectually. So just be on the lookout for the people who are grateful for what you're doing, do what you're doing, and just document it as best you can. The methodologists, the researchers, and so forth, they'll show up. There's not a lack of people who know how to do the studies. They don't smell the funds. At the moment, almost everybody's hungry. The few people like me who decided to work for a living, we're not hungry, but we're too popular. I don't want to be popular. I want to rock on my porch and watch the fox come by and, eat some ginger in the garden. But yes, if you folks find a researcher, actually, I have a suggestion. Since you're in the Bay Area, are you in the Bay Area? No, where are you? Seattle?
I'm in Arizona, Keely's in Wisconsin, and Eric's in Nevada in
I
Tahoe.
am within driving distance of the Bay Area.
Well, in regard to the Bay Area, I would look up the woman Laura Schmidt, S-C-H-M-I-T-T, Laura Schmidt. She was at a conference that a friend of mine put together that has moved the needle in regard to essential fats, omega-3, omega-6. And the reason she was at the meeting was because our common friend who wrote the book Metabolical was too busy. But Laura, as far as I know, is still at UCSF. She writes succinctly, clearly, passionately, and she has friends. She might actually be looking for something to chew on right now. So if you can, look up Laura Schmidt. It's called the Bellagio Conference. It's a little place on Lake Como called Bellagio Sfondrata. When you get invited to those meetings, just show up. And I will tell you that my room, the sun rises over 5 little hills in order to get to Lake Como. From that bedroom, if it gets better, let me know. But you can't stay. I tried to move in. They wouldn't let me. I'm saying something very simple. You should continue doing exactly what you're doing in exactly the ways you're doing it, but be on the lookout for somebody who cares, who has resources, and I don't care if it's a trust fund or they made it themselves. Right now, there are people with enough money sloshing around that is looking for something to do that will be memorable and meaningful. However, most of them are captive of the very people who would shut you down. So obviously you have to go to the less conventional or the unconventional, not the conventional.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking at our work right now and just trying to figure out if we're credible or not. And I believe our interview today has gone a long way towards establishing.
Oh, I hope so. I was just going to say, if there's anything that I would feel good about from today, it would be validating what you're already doing and encouraging others to support what you're doing. Much needed.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. We won't take any more of your time. And again, if you have those resources on paper, feel free to send it to my email. I'll keep in touch with Justin. And hopefully we can have you on in the future, because we actually wanted to learn more about your ELISA, your biotechnology company.
No, I'd be happy to show how it evokes human healing response and restores tolerance, but that's the appetizer for the next conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and record our outro, okay?
Of course.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It was a wonderful conversation with Dr. Russell Jaffe. I mean, this man is amazing. I am so happy that he agreed to join us today. We've covered some really interesting topics, everything that pretty much we all have been thinking about and what we want to know, and also some information on how we can get some research going into solving some of these issues that we're currently facing. So please like, share, comment on our content. Also check out our GoFundMe and Patreon pages to keep this podcast rolling and also to put towards research. Thank you again, everyone. We'll see you next time. Cool. Thank you. Oh man, this just really made me so happy. You have no idea the person that we had on the other day. You probably know who she is. And we didn't understand who she was until we did some more digging on her, and she's actually an industry bot expert.
No, I understand. And no, there are the people who are zealots on one side. There are the people who are zealots on the other side. There need to be a few people like me.
There are far and few, unfortunately.
No, I very specifically chose to leave that wagon train and all that supported me because of that, go into the wilderness and come back and make a living. Because if you can't support yourself, you're dependent on someone else. And this is a very personal little anecdote to end with, but Rebecca and I, early in our relationship, we sat in this living room on a couch, and Rebecca says to me, I know you're following your bliss, but couldn't you make a living? Do we have to be this poor? And I said, no, I'll figure out how to make a living. And at that moment, the couch collapsed. It was saying that I should get up off the couch and go make a living. And I figured out how to do that. So yes, I think we need to have people who I've had the great good fortune of being well trained in scientific method and all that goes with that, and research and so forth, but who are not biased. If you know the answer before you do the study, I suggest you not do the study. Only if you don't know the answer and can be honest about whether it's a question, in my opinion, could you even do an honest study. Because I'll tell you, the enthusiasm of the scientist observer actually influences the results. Another time, I'll tell you how that was confirmed. But if the investigator knows the answer or is enthusiastic about the answer or is paid for the answer, that biases the results. You wouldn't think so, but it does.
Dr. Jaffe, you remind me of a modern day Thoreau with that story.
That's really very nice. That's very nice. I mean, I absolutely admire him. He was not easy to get along with, by the way, but he was worth it. So thank you. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, that my husband, that's his aspirations in life. Ever since he read Walden, he's like,
does he want to go and live on the lake?
I'm sorry, does my husband live on the lake?
Does he want to go and live on a lake? You know, Walden, you know, he was really not a recluse. He was not a recluse. He loved nature. He loved the nurturance of nature. The problem is that I wanted a relationship, and I hope your husband wants one with you. So it's nice to go to the lake, but come back.
Well, I want to go to the lake with him. So, you know,
that's up to you and he. Not so easy, by the way, because when Rebecca and I would go places, very often we would go together, we would come back together. But when we were there, she went her way, I went mine.
I love that. Well, I feel like at this moment in time, I don't really have a choice. I kind of have to go live in the lake because I'm so intolerant to conventional buildings. It's hard for me to get around.
No. Do you know about Beatrice Trumhunter?
Mm-mm.
Beatrice Trumhunter had 400 acres in the middle of New Hampshire that she has donated to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine so that people like you can go and live on that land because it's absolutely pure. And she was one of the people who mentored me when I was skeptical about environmental medicine. And then she introduced me to Ted Randolph and Bill Ray, and the people who really are the giants and pioneers of environmental American medicine. But look at Beatrice Trumhunter, and it's Hillsborough, New Hampshire.
Wow.
Of the 400 acres, about 80 is a lake. And I used to go and stay there. She was incredibly gracious.
Is this still, this is still happening today? Because it seems like
to the best of my knowledge, B passed when she was 93. She bequeathed the land to the AAEM. As far as I know, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine manages her property in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, so that people who are chemically sensitive can go and stay and recover.
Oh man, I would love to reach out and check that
Oh,
out.
by all means. No, by all means.
Yeah.
And by the way, the White Truck Museum is there. And her mother-in-law was a famous photographer, Lotta Jacoby. And I went up to visit B, and I happened to wear a sailor suit. Now I'm an adult, but I'm wearing a sailor suit, you know, like a child would wear. And we go to this White Truck Museum, and I'm climbing around on these old rusty trucks, and Lotta is taking photos. And it looked like a child playing with child's trucks until you realize these are full-size 18-wheelers, and he's an adult. He just happens to be wearing a sailor suit. She sends me the photos, and I say, oh boy, I really like these. I'm going to put them in a box. I said, but Lotta signed them. Oh, she said, you don't understand. If Lotta signs them, they're worth a lot of money. That's how she pays you.
Wow.
With someone like B or someone like Lotta, you never think about payment. You think about the privilege of helping them. But she, Lotta, the photographer, she was famous because she wanted to hang out with physicists. She wanted to hang out with Heisenberg and Bohr and Einstein and Fermi, and she did because she was their candid photo biographer.
Absolutely, that's amazing.
Unbelievable. To meet her was a privilege. And I'll close with this story. B calls me up and says, Lotta's dying. I said, what's she dying of? Oh, it's a mystery. Nobody can figure it out. I said, I think I'll make a house call. So I go in the hospital. I say, Lotta, what's going on? She says, I'm dying. I said, what are you dying of? She says, I'm dying. I said, well, what are you dying of? She said, 10 years ago, a Brahmin in Boston who was a psychic told me I'd live 10 years. And it's been 10 years. I said, Lotta, I know who you're talking about. I never met her, but I know she was a competent psychic, which means she would never tell you when you're going to die. What she said was, you're going to live at least 10 years, not at most. She said, good point, threw off the bedclothes and said, where's the Remy Martin? I went home. Sometimes you just have to show up and give them permission to live.
Oh, that was very touching.
Okay, so look at Hillsborough, look at Beatrice from Hunter land. I think it is now the AAEM whatever, that they're the trustees for it. But she very specifically wanted it to be a place where people could come and stay while they were healing. And since I'm telling you this story, I'm going to finish with this one. This is a postscript story. I'm staying with B. I get up, it's 4 a.m. I don't want to disturb her. I tiptoe down because I'm in the back, which is where the guest room is. She's on the mezzanine. That's where her bedroom is. Downstairs is the kitchen and the pantry. As I tiptoe past her door, I smell roses and cigar smoke. It's January. Roses? Maybe it's B. Hunter. Cigar smoke? Not B. Hunter. I'm downstairs, she comes down, she puts the tea on, we're having breakfast. I say, B, is there any chance that early this morning I could have smelled roses and cigar smoke? And she starts to cry. I said, B, what did I say? She said, I have a gentleman caller and he comes to me when I'm dreaming and he brings me roses and he smokes cigars. You are the first person who confirmed that I'm not just making this up. I said, oh, that's so sweet. And I gave her a big hug. So sometimes when you're really surprised, it's for a good reason.
I feel like I want to hold you hostage all day and just
No, unfortunately, we all have other things to do. But yes, we can schedule another time, of course.
Sure. Thank you again. And we'll see you next time. Have a good one.
You the same.
Take
Ciao.
care.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe.
That was so great. That really made up for the bitch face bitch. What did you think, Eric? You guys had a lot to connect on. It's crazy that.
Oh my God. So much. I mean,
Right?
like that story about the EPA headquarters in Washington. If you look at the Chester Levine abstract, it was done on the original chronic fatigue syndrome cohort. And they also mentioned the Elk Grove teachers. And the other one is an unnamed building in Washington, D.C. That's the one. See, they didn't want to say it because they didn't want to implicate a government building because, it's like they're trying to be cautious about this. So it's like you put all the pieces of the puzzle together and you can tell exactly what the CDC and NIH knew at the time in 1994, but they're pretending to be ignorant and know nothing about it.
Yeah, that was pretty nuts.
I wasn't able to contact anybody from the EPA building, but I did, obviously, with the Truckee teachers and with the Elk Grove teachers, and said, well, have you heard about Stachybotrys? They go, yeah, that's the one. And then I found out from Dr. Shoemaker years later that when the EPA headquarters was analyzed, they found Stachybotrys there too. And going, this darn black mold is showing up in too many of these mystery illness clusters to be ignored.
I just realized I didn't mute my mic when I went pee. I'm so sorry. I'm embarrassed. Did you guys hear me go pee?
Nah.
Oh my God.
And I wouldn't care if I did.
Okay.
I muted mine when I screamed at my kids.
Oh man. Yeah, that was so good. He's definitely one with stories.
Yeah, fascinating that he confirmed what I said about Strauss.
Yeah, I was messaging Keely and saying, oh man, this is where Eric can clear the air, because we were talking about making an episode, but that was a 2-in-1. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But in terms of what I talked about, Strauss being kind of an evil son of a bitch, when he went to the Office of Alternative Medicine, kind of to destroy it. See, I still believe that's true, because he said he was going to bring scientific rigor to this much hated new office that was opened up under the auspices of the NIH to investigate these, folk tales, old wives' tales, herbal remedies. See, Strauss wasn't really into that. He prided himself on being a real plodding, methodical scientist. So they knew that if they put this guy in charge, if something wasn't absolutely rock solid, I mean, he would seize upon any clue to dispute it, like in acupuncture. He actually did confirm that there was some basis for acupuncture. But in terms of the bee pollen and all the other stuff that they looked at, he goes, no, this is all a crock of shit. But sometimes it's a little more complicated. And you can't just use Koch's postulates. You go, well, we threw this bee pollen on somebody and it wasn't an instant cure, so therefore it's disproven. You have to analyze the circumstances. And that's something that Strauss wasn't very good at.
Wow.
I got to admit, though, that Jaffe referred to Sir Donald Acheson coining the term myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is used in Canada and Great Britain. Well, Acheson made that very incredible observation about cold and damp causing relapse in ME. What is that? Cold and damp.
Yeah.
Patients, experiencing change in the weather and cold and damp would be not only precipitated into a relapse, but sometimes revert to the same condition when they first got the illness. And to me, that was just an amazing observation. And Strauss, he came across that. He saw the same thing. So if it hadn't been for Cheney and Peterson and the power of the CFIDS Association keeping the focus on viruses, it could very well have been possible that Strauss might have gotten his way and looked into the sick building syndrome.
Yeah. This was a lot of underlying garbage.
But I believe that what happened at Tahoe is there was a flu going through. Dr. Gary Holmes said that it was an avian influenza, H5N3. And, we see from the coronavirus, we see from our history with these avian influenzas that they were powerful cytokine initiators. I mean, they cause a cytokine cascade. So that means that when you're analyzing the sequela from this type of illness, you can't just look at the virus by itself. You have to look at the environmental circumstances. And if you do that with the Tahoe outbreak, you could see that this was the precipitating event that turned the sick building syndrome, something you could recover from when you went home on weekends, into a chronic, permanent injury.
Yeah.
That's not too complicated.
Right? Bird flu is starting to make a comeback, I think.
Yeah.
And some girl died of the plague in Colorado. I'm like, oh, hell no. I'm out of here.
There is so much crap going on right now.
The candida, auroras, the fucking plague, the bird flu.
Well, I believe that the vitamin D clue, how everywhere you look, people are suffering from lower levels of vitamin D. And you can check people in the sunniest locations and they're still dropping. I mean, you can't get enough sunlight to have normal amounts of vitamin D. And this tells us that immune surveillance, because vitamin D is anti-inflammatory corticosteroid. It's not just, something like a vitamin like people think. It's actually a very important signaling element of the immune system. And the fact that this is going haywire in pretty much everybody tells us that environmental toxins, some kind of environmental pressure, maybe it's cosmic rays, but whatever it is, it's affecting everybody. So we do have lowered immune surveillance, even in the healthiest of individuals.
Yeah. You know, I heard a doctor saying that they even tested like surfers who spend their entire time in the sun and they still have low vitamin D.
Exactly. And you talk to most doctors and they'll immediately say, well, you just need to get out in the sun more. Well, what? Yeah, how are you supposed to do that?
Yeah.
And they're missing the clue that, quit focusing on lack of sunlight. This is supposed to tell you you've got to look in another direction.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty crazy at this point.
And the effects are so insidious because this conversation is reminding me like what we were talking about right before Jaffe joined the interview, and I was talking to you guys about getting hit at that church yesterday. Yeah. It's like the inner city on the south side. So it's like south side of Milwaukee is like, what Jaffe was saying, like if you want to look at the health of a neighborhood, look at the socioeconomic status. Like this is a neighborhood where a lot of people don't even have documents to work, so they're probably not even paid. They're poor people. It's a poor neighborhood. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know why I'm trying to sugarcoat it. But it was like, okay, so we went to 2 baptisms over the weekend, same neighborhood for both of them. I got hit at both places, which made me connect it when I went to that's how I started putting it together, that it's like everyone in that neighborhood, I think, brought a little bit into that church. And then that whole area, before I even went in, I started reacting to just being in the parking lot with all the cars and stuff. And then it was such a classic, perfect example of the rebreathe effect. When I go to greet the people whose baptism it is, and I like go down to like greet the little girl, and I'm like talking to her a little bit, and as I'm talking, my breath must have gone off something that was on them, or I don't know, Eric, you could probably explain it. I don't know exactly how it works, like how you explain it, but all of a sudden, just that getting closer to them and talking and breathing, it explodes in my face. And I'm in a church at a baptism, and I can't scream or panic. I have to be polite and poised. And I'm looking around at all the little kids, and like, you can tell I'm an eye person. So like, I feel like you can look into somebody's eyes and tell, like, are they glazed over? Are they present? Are they focused? Are they out of it? And I'm looking at all these kids, and like their eyes are just like vacant. It's like they're low level, all sick, to the point where no one realizes it. And I'm looking at this church, and I'm like, it's everyone here. It's this whole place. It's all of their houses. Like, it's all of these kids. Like, look at them.
Scary.
And no one's, and then we have conversations with fungal geneticists who are the experts in their fields, who we can't have this conversation with. What's going to happen to the kids of this?
Well, we've already seen what's happening. They're dropping like flies. They're committing suicide.
Yeah, that is really weird. Like COVID and the whole, oh, you know what? I was talking to a nurse. I went to go get a vitamin C IV because I wanted to try it. And she was working at the Mayo Clinic before she quit to go work at this little IV place. And she was saying how, like, when COVID started, their adolescent psychiatric unit like tripled in size, and that there were so many children on suicide watch. And she was just
imagine
like,
everyone locked in their moldy houses. Who hasn't considered suicide while living inside of a moldy house? I mean, like, you just are so hopeless.
hell,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, and I told environmental researchers years ago, I said in groups that you're going to be able to watch as this paradigm progresses, because you're going to see an amazing spike in suicides, and it's not going to make any sense to you. It's only when you put it in context and realize, the environment that it's driving into this, you'll start to see how quickly this paradigm has come upon us.
Yeah. So I try to tell my husband, because he's always like, oh, when we have kids. And I'm just like, oh.
You guys can borrow mine for weeks at a time. It's like a trial, and then you guys can decide.
Can you ship them UPS? Just box them up,
I'll see if I can FedEx them.
Auntie Alicia.
I'll put a fragile sticker and stick some walnuts and some water in there. They'll be okay. I'll overnight them.
That's cute. I don't know.
We should go check out that land they were talking about or inquire in that.
Oh my God, I'm gonna go look that up right now. I'm gonna check.
I know they've got that place that was in the Afflicted movie that's no EMFs at all. They don't even allow a radio into this property. That's another interesting place.
I wouldn't mind checking that out too. Isn't that where people who are like EMF sensitive go live, and there's like that big piece of equipment that can't have any EMF interference?
Exactly.
Yeah, I've heard
Except
about that.
They seem to be completely oblivious to mold.
But I heard that place is really moldy. So
yeah,
is it just because there's no like Wi-Fi signals to kind of like they're not reacting to the mold?
I think what they're doing is essentially like when you step away from your oven, they back away from the oven and they think that's the cure. They're not putting it together with the way the mold effect is amplifying EMFs. I think that's the missing piece of their puzzle.
Yeah, the EMF people are missing that part.
So wait, there's a place where people live where there's no EMFs, but they're still sick, basically?
Have you seen the Afflicted movie on Netflix?
No.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Got to watch it.
Okay.
It covers mold. It covers EMFs.
I will never freaking forget. I swear I was probably like 21 or 22 and I was watching this Discovery Channel show, and it was showing people that like literally had to go and live in a cave in order to feel some sense of normalcy. But they blamed it on EMFs. They didn't say anything about mold.
Yeah, there's a gal. It's amazing. This Afflicted movie. They've got people, one from MECFS, one from mold, one from the EMF, and it's like there's all these theories, and you can see the interplay, the disparity between how they're all approaching this from a different angle. It's fascinating. And one of the gals, Becca Fly, she recovered in the desert by building a mold-free trailer. And she lived out in the desert for a year, and now she's got enough tolerance. She's been able to move back into society, and she put her trailer up for sale. I don't know if she ever sold it. This was a long time ago.
I'm curious to see how she's doing now. I swear she's probably back to square one.
I don't know, once you really get good at mold avoidance, you can move back into town, keep yourself, above the power curve, on the good side of the power curve, and you look fairly normal from then on.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, when you were talking about how the pollution came and went into that basin, you know what you made me think of? I realized when I was driving around the whole area trying to like see where things were coming from and like kind of scoping out my area a little bit more, what I realized is my whole town is like lower, like in a hill, like in a hole, like in a basin. And I'm wondering if I'm almost experiencing something like you described, where like the inner city pollution, I don't know if it's coming this way, sinking into the basin, or if there's other pollution, and just because it's lower, where it's like kind of, am I making sense?
Of course, that's how Truckee is.
Yeah,
Though our towns on, like in the pits of these mountains, it's just weird. Isn't it better to be on the mountain than like?
Yeah, that's how Reno is. That's how Carson City is.
Yeah. But the air is much purer at higher elevation, right?
Yeah.
So how does that work then? Like, if you're higher elevation than the pollution, do you still get hit with it, or it just kind of settles out in the valleys?
Well, I think the valleys are high risk for accumulations of chemicals and nanoparticles, all these various pollutants. But what really struck me about the Lake Tahoe experience was the way buildings that were up on the side of a mountain, up at high elevations, were suddenly spewing something toxic. And so that's where I came up with the idea that mold is actually collecting, condensing, and emitting something, some toxic substance that's potentiating the effect. And after mulling over everything it could possibly be, the only thing that really had that kind of mechanism was nanoparticles.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Do you think that Dr. Jaffe answered that question okay about the particles?
No.
Yeah, I kind of felt like it wasn't like a...
Yeah, he gravitated towards the tight building since the 1970s theory.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a trap because
So
that
she's
creates.
asking about when she asked about the Saharan dust storm. That's what she's asking.
Well, yeah, in order to answer that properly, from my perspective, you'd have to look at Kawasaki disease. How amazing it is that the point of origin doesn't manifest the kind of illness that happens in the areas where the particles rain down. What's the deal with that? You would think that if a toxin came from a certain area, the Sahara Desert, or like Lake Chad, they found Aspergillus sidawi that was from a species that they genetically identified as being directly from Lake Chad, which is suffering a drought, getting these massive dust storms, plowing this stuff high up into the stratosphere, going across the Atlantic and landing on the Caribbean. So they found the same exact species of mold from Lake Chad, killing coral and making children sick in the Caribbean. And yet it doesn't seem to make people that sick in the place where it came from. So what's the deal with that? So I've compared that to Kawasaki disease, and I go, wow, it almost seems like the fungal toxins, they acquire an additional property by having passed through this stratospheric air layer. So what could be happening up there that could confer an additional pathogenesis, like Kawasaki disease? They say the candida toxins that are affecting people, they've got an upregulated immune system to these fungal toxins, and they know the fungal toxins come from China, but why don't they make people so sick in China and slam the crap out of people in Japan? Mm-hmm. And Dr. Ian Lipkin is kind of fascinated by this. And he's picked up on the concept that somehow along the way, by being in the air, it's more powerful than where it came from. What can do that? I don't know of anything except nanoparticles.
Yeah, because I was looking at some studies where they've tested the soils or the dust from these areas where, the big dust storms happen, and that there are already pollutants settled in the dust too.
Yeah, but if you look at it from a conventional doctor mindset, you're going to go, well, if you see illness or environmental catastrophe occurring where this dust settles in a foreign country, then you'll be able to find that same illness in the source point where it came from. Same toxin, same thing, right? Sure. But that's not what we see.
Yeah.
Kind of weird. Now, I can't say I have all the answers, but at least I got a crazy theory.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll start. I'm going to get some information from this fundraiser gal that works for a nonprofit and just look at their donor packets just to see if maybe we could emulate them or copy them and try to find some people to give us money to do the studies.
Well, it is just like mind-boggling, awesome the way he confirmed, what I said about the early history of sick building syndrome, and especially its relationship with Stephen Strauss, and how he said Strauss was the good guy. Now we have the opportunity here to really shake up the chronic fatigue syndrome, the MECFS community, because they think Strauss and Holmes are the worst people on the planet, like evil conspirators who deliberately arrived with the sole intention of destroying the ME, the integrity of the ME syndrome. And here I am as a prototype of chronic fatigue syndrome saying, well, it wasn't exactly like that. Strauss wasn't as bad as you think. So with his confirmation, we can put that out in some sound bites and just scare the living shit out of them.
Yeah, we can create a bunch of graphics from this transcript. I think that really like pulling quotes from the interviews.
Yeah, and then we'll put it on blast on all of their pages, on all their foundation pages.
Yeah, and I think, like he says, if we're perceived as credible, we've got new information, we've got some ideas, then maybe we will get that good person with money that will come and talk to us.
Either that or somebody high profile eventually is going to get as sick as we've been and like go seeking answers. And anyone who's looking hopefully would find us. I started to get the sense that at a certain point when being asked about the research of some of like the bigger picture things, I kind of felt like he was following along with us, even though he didn't like clearly verbally confirm. And it almost sounded like he kind of said, now correct me if you guys didn't pick this up, but it almost sounded like he was kind of saying, like reading between the words, that the research exists and what we really need is to piece it together and then have someone with a credible name maybe publish an analysis on all of it. Because
yeah, and we need money.
Yeah.
And I don't think we need to be shy about saying we need a rich patron.
Yeah, I think we have to start a campaign. Like I said, there's a gal that, actually Joe Chernesky, that poor dude that's suffering like crazy. He hooked me up with this gal that works for like some American Cancer Society or something. She's going to give me their donor packets on how they ask for money. So maybe we're just going to have to create our own little packets and just kind of hammer down exactly what we want to do and maybe make a deck out of it and send it out and, ask if people are interested. Are you interested in doing this?
I think if we hit a certain level of credibility, that, like he says, the people with money will kind of come to our door.
Okay, so we shouldn't put so much effort into finding. We should just keep doing what we're doing. And
yeah, I think because trying to rely on the small donations. Look at what's happening with the small institutes that try. I mean, they struggle with it. ICEA, they get what, $5,000 for their so-called study into mycotoxins. It's pathetic. I mean, we've got to aim higher than that.
oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like making big donor packets where we go to these rich people and we say, hey.
I think if we are perceived as being really credible,
Yeah.
that the people behind the scenes, the ones who really, really have money and motivation, that they will probably find us.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he was saying. I feel like don't get discouraged, don't stop. You guys are doing good work, and the right people will find you if you continue this. Is what I felt like his response was to us.
Yeah, he said it straight out. He goes, they just haven't heard of you.
Yeah. Yep. Well, the more people we interview and get on, the better.
Oh, this has been awesome beyond belief. And what really blows me away, and I'm going to post about this, is I talked about how the researchers came and they wouldn't listen to us. And one of them, another incline survivor, he was trying to approach them, Dr. Mady Hornig and Maureen Hansen and the other big names. I mean, he was getting right in their faces talking about the Bateson building. And it's like, wow, how peculiar is that? Here, an Incline Village survivor somebody got sick. And Incline Village at the time of the viral outbreak is trying so hard to get in their faces about the Bateson building, about a sick building incident. Seems a little odd, doesn't it? Well, when I was down at the Open Medicine Foundation, look who's sitting right in front of me. Same guy. He was trying to hit them.
Wow. That's crazy.
How amazing is that? There's two Incline Village survivors, both doing the exact same thing, trying to hit the same researchers, and we wind up sitting at the same table. And it was pure accident. We didn't know each other.
So what is that person doing now? They've given up, I guess.
Well, he's not aggressive like I am. So it's like he'll politely say, you know, when you start out doing this, you think, well, these are good researchers. All I have to do is like tell them I know something, and then they'll open their minds. And he's still in that phase where he's probably in shock that you try to hand them information on a silver platter and they fight you about it.
Yeah.
It almost seems like some of the industry experts are there to hold the line. Like they're gatekeepers. Like the interview that we did with the fungal geneticist, I felt like when she said, I'm heading into uncomfortable territory, I thought, oh, we asked the right question and she doesn't want to talk about it. And it kind of feels like these people at the highest level of the information, it's almost like they're trained on keeping the narrative, to keep people like us who are knocking the doors, asking for it to open and get that information that's on the other side of the door brought out to the rest of the house. They're like, bitch, I'm gonna lock this door.
Well, they're being rewarded for what they do. So the people going for the money, they rise to the top. They get the rewards. The people who are honest, they get stamped out.
Yeah, she wants to get her laboratory of rats. Mice and rats.
Yeah, this system is completely corrupt. I mean, it selects for corrupt people. It rewards corrupt people.
I mean, Jaffe did a really good job of explaining all of that, I felt like. I mean, he didn't shy away from talking about that.
Yeah.
Well, because he's not in it anymore. He said, I'm out. You know?
That's what chased him out, it sounded like, the corruption.
Yeah, and he's right. In the 1980s, the NIH, they completely lost their way and turned into a completely corrupt organization.
I wonder what was behind the scenes on that. That sounds like a good story.
The conversation we had is such just gold. That is so gold.
Well, he talked about the vaccine, the vaccine companies. They basically took over the Center for Disease Control in the mid-1980s, and the CDC became a front for vaccines. I mean, yeah, they go through the motions of pretending that they're some kind of great, public service organization, but essentially they are there to protect the vaccine companies. And at that same time, with the Hep B and the Hep C vaccines, the NIH they were corrupted. All the people that want to do pure science, they got chased out.
That hepatitis thing was really crazy to me because, I mean, isn't there even conspiracy with CIA having control of these drugs and bringing them in?
Okay, I cannot believe he just called the DEA and they gave him 10 kilograms of heroin. What? I was like, there's no way. And it was, we got to get our hands on that study to publish with this episode. I can't believe he found hepatitis in heroin. It's almost like they're purposely making junkies get sick so that they can be permanently injured or sicker or less functioning in society because of their choices. How does hepatitis get inside heroin?
Infectious hepatitis on top of that.
I do remember that was actually made public, that they did talk about the heroin users, the drug addicts, and they were all going to get Hep C. But in terms of having it proven that hepatitis could withstand the chemical processes involved. That I didn't know.
But I think it's like how it's common knowledge to me is that, like, if you're a junkie and you're sharing needles, you're going to pass a communicable disease if someone has it. That's a different getting hepatitis from doing heroin than the heroin that actually has hepatitis in it.
That's what we all assumed, that it was going to be sharing needles and just their poor choices. Yeah.
Right.
So that
Bullshit. It almost makes me think of AIDS.
yeah, and he talked about the corruption of the Gallo lab. And one thing that we have to bring up if we ever get Garth Nicholson to talk to us is how Professor Luc Montagnier has this belief that if it weren't for the mycoplasma enabler, that HIV would never progress to full-blown AIDS.
Oh my God. What?
But you know, the Gallo lab and the researchers knew that even if HHV6 was not the cause of the mystery disease, they knew that this was a butt-kicking virus. So why did it disappear? Why did it get dropped so badly? They didn't drop CMV, they didn't drop EBV the way they dropped HHV6. It's like HHV6 just fell off the face of the planet there. That was weird.
I am convinced that all these diseases that we all have have all been bioengineered and have been released into society.
Is HHV6 the so that's like a variant of the herpes virus, is that correct?
Yeah.
Now, is that where it will present like kind of like anywhere on the body?
No.
Okay.
The roseola, the common bee strain, yeah, that causes a rash. And then typically you hold it in restraint, just like EBV. But that's the one, everybody gets this confused. They really screwed up when they named it. And I think they did this deliberately to create confusion. The HHV6, which was the first one discovered, had an amazing cytopathic effect. It was killing B cells like crazy. I mean, so bad that when they tested our blood, they thought it was a lab error because they couldn't find any B cells. They were totally wiped out. We don't see this cytopathic effect with the B strain, only the A strain. And then they found out that the A strain, in addition to this, it affects the nerves. It's primarily neurotropic. So the neurological effects of the A strain are off the charts, whereas the B strain, very mild.
That's really interesting.
Right.
Yeah, Dr. Peterson says that classic CFS, the original syndrome, the entity that he had in his practice, is actually HBLV or HHV6 alpha disease. And that's what he treats with Ampligen. And one of the things that his criteria for the Ampligen program was whether or not you've got reactivated HHV6 alpha. And all these researchers, they read this and they just like forget it and go, oh, well, you just had a reactivated virus or you had HHV6. And they don't differentiate. If they had kept the original name, HBLV, and then named the roseola virus something else, there wouldn't be this confusion. And they must know that. So it seems like they must have done it deliberately.
Is just so crazy to me.
I mean, it's really hard to wrap your head around the people in medicine and health and healing are doing something that's opposite of that. I mean, it just feels like we're in the middle of this weird, bizarre, dark science, sick science experiment. I don't know. I don't get how when you dive into the details of what medicine is, what you actually find is like a sick, twisted, lying science experiment.
Yeah, you're sounding like me now.
Well, I mean, you can see it when you look into this, like, write down every single symptom you've ever had from toxic mold, and then go research those symptoms and find the disease mechanisms behind that. You can trace it back to certain, like, failures in the system. You can't say just there's
Well, what the thing is, you look back at the history and you go, wait a minute, this researcher knew that and he didn't say anything? I mean, he watched people get sick. He watched his colleagues be in so much confusion and he didn't say anything?
Or the people who have, like, sick family members or sick kids or sick parents, and then they're not.
Yeah. I compare it to, what if somebody in the early days of Lyme disease found out that they isolated Borrelia in the Lyme disease children, the ones with this mystery illness, and then decided to become a Lyme specialist and not tell anybody. Oh, well, we can fix you with vitamins, and Lyme disease is just a vague, broad category. It's got Babesia, Bartonella, Borrelia, it's just a toxic soup. Why would you do that if you know that it's not toxic soup, that it was initiated by Borrelia?
Well, we wouldn't do that.
Create more sick people so that way they have more business. Keep them sicker for longer because it's harder to treat once it's in a chronic phase.
I thought that even, I anticipated that Dr. Schumacher was going to run into problems when he found out there's more to it than the mycotoxin. There's the particles. So eventually he's going to have to hit a point where he goes, well, this doesn't quite match. It doesn't quite fit. So I warned him and I told him, I did it in my presentation in 2015. You have to watch out for the nanoparticle effect or you're going to stay confused. And they just completely dropped it. So when he made this turnaround, this pivot on toxic mold, I'm going, but you can't do that. The Stachybotrys has proven itself. Yeah, it's not the sum total, but this is enough of a clue that you can't just throw it out completely. But he did. Oh, yeah, that building, the Bateson building. And he talked about, Jaffe talked about how they had to bake off the building. That's not all they did. They had to redesign it so it had more air circulation. And that heating system with the heated water that was cascading over all the rocks, they had to disable that. So it's still part of the architectural makeup, but it's not functional. They don't use it the same way it was designed. So they had to shut that down because they knew that masterpiece of the cascading water was going to be spewing microbes into the air.
Wow. But he said there was some health effect to having water in there. Was he referring to the ions? Or what? I didn't quite catch that, I guess.
I think that maybe he was just framing that as the microbial toxic soup. I don't think he really focused in on, the water.
I had a little bit of a different take on his response to the Saharan dust storm. I almost thought correct me if I'm missing a piece here, but I almost felt like his explanation was almost validating your theory because of the things that he said were blowing in, like arsenic and mercury. Those seem like things that if fungi started to feed off of or other microbes started to feed off of, that would produce this effect too of having them excrete more violent toxins. So it almost seemed like there was a connection, or at least I thought that's what I heard.
Yeah, I heard the same thing. It's like he's seeing the pattern that these microbes, these dust storms, are picking up something in the air and raining it on a location, so that location suffers worse than the area that it came from.
It almost seemed like his response, validated clues towards the nanoparticle effect of why
I agree.
it's so bad.
I like to think so. Yeah.
I mean, that's what
But if you have a mental image of how nanoparticles work, how they clump together and they agglomerate all these toxins, all the acid rain and all the volatiles and everything sticks to them. And then once they clump into a macromolecule, because their surface energy is so high that they clump and become heavy enough, and then they fall out of the sky in large concentrations, then it's like, oh, it just seems natural that these things, these nanoparticles, would be scrubbing all this crap out of the air and raining it down on wherever the clouds form when it hits land, and all this stuff rains out of it. So yeah, I think we're in total agreement on that.
Wait, is that my step grandpa? Tell him to try the tea that I sent you. But that starts with an H. I've been wanting to tell you that.
Step grandpa. Hey, your mom's gonna get rid of her moldy stuff, for sure.
You had mentioned, Eric, that he originally got sick from consuming dead crayfish when all the crayfish died, and so that tea, the one that has a longer Chinese name that starts with an H, that's actually a formula for like if you went to another country and you weren't sure if you were going to get food poisoning, that's something that you would bring with to like shorten duration of symptoms and heal faster. It's for like gut dysfunction from being poisoned is one of the uses. So I thought maybe if he was having symptoms one day, if you made him a cup of tea, he could maybe, I don't know if it would maybe, I think it could help. I think it could be helpful. So make him some tea.
Oh, Eric's like, ah, that shit.
He's like, I hate the smell.
Go spend a day in the woods.
Well, you know, the science of this is fascinating to me, but equally important is the sociology of it, where we have literally hit 100% CFS researchers refusing to look at the evidence that this syndrome was going to solve. Wow, that's like unprecedented in history.
Well, and it's the attitude they're taking towards everything now in medicine. Yeah. It's a whole complete grab at the health of an entire nation.
Yeah. It's misleading.
It's more than just CFS researchers not responding. Like your military training called this out how many years ago, Eric? This has been implemented for a long time.
Yeah, how did they know?
They finally have had so much effort in the back end that the flip has happened, and now we're seeing the effects, and everyone's too brainwashed to realize it.
Well, this was an amazing interview, and I don't know, you might have to break this one up into two parts. I mean, you just go into mental overload.
Yeah, it was.
But it confirms everything we're saying.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it out there.
Awesome.
I'll put it all out. So, okay, so I'm thinking, so today was that lady, and then maybe I was thinking Caleb's next, Caleb and Sean's, and then the one where we talk about everything. Because when we kind of uncover everything, it kind of goes with both those conversations. I just wanted to know what you guys think.
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah,
I like it. But in the meantime, we can stir up the crap in the MECFS community by saying that Strauss was actually not the bad guy they think he was.
Let's put out some graphics on that. Let's pull some quotes from the transcript today and just plummet the internet with graphics on that and put them everywhere and quote them.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
And then,
awesome.
Just send me the audio and then I'll
oh yeah. I was gonna ask you if you have the transcripts from the Shoemaker talks.
Yes, they're not edited though.
Oh, that's okay. You don't have to like fix every word. I could probably figure it out. I just want to read through those, and then I think there was other things I wanted to ask you, but I'm forgetting now. I'm getting moldy from my computer.
Okay, I think we've gone long enough for today.
Okay, I'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah, I'll send over those transcripts right now then.
Oh, there's one more thing. Just one second.
Okay.
I'll text you if it comes to me. I'll message you guys if it comes to me.
Alrighty.
Okay.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.